Hi folks, today I'm going to show a demo of the orchestration scripting system. And specifically I'm going to show 3 different scripts today. For each demo, I'll first talk a little bit about the challenges in kind of supporting each of these interactions and give an example of what kind of situation that occurs in the DTR community that we're trying to script for. And then I'll explain like how we actually write these scripts and show a running code demo of each of these scripts running. So to start with the first one of the scripts we want to be able to encode is really just describing situations for collaboration, for feedback, or for support around the community's existing venues, tools, and processes. One of the hallmarks of a network learning community is that you have so many different venues and support opportunities throughout the week. And working well in these kind of communities involves learning how to use and plan one's working process around those venues. So this could involve discussing plans with a mentor during a SIG meeting, then using a Mysore and pair research during studio later in the week to work on the things that you discussed, maybe getting another round of feedback from mentors on during your office hours, and then eventually completing your deliverables and planning for the next sprint at the next SIG meeting. However, this doesn't always happen. One breakdown that we found through some early need finding was that students often don't bring in a slice of work to discuss with their mentors at office hours, either because they don't plan for it, or they forget to send it and then they can't get feedback on that slice during office hours. And because of that, later on, students can miss an opportunity to iterate on their process or how they think about their work. That they could have done before their deliverables were finished that week instead of waiting until the next sprint. And one way that we already try to sort this issue is that mentors in DTR will create these little Slackbot reminders like we have here, where they'll ask students to share any agenda items, any documents, or anything that the mentor should read during office hours and that they want to discuss with the mentors. So this already shows that mentors do find it useful to be able to describe these opportunities when students could check in with them in terms of when different venues are occurring. So we have one for office hours, we could equally have one for a studio meeting or for a SIG meeting. And while this is very much doable for one student or one project for one venue, setting these up for many venues and many students could become very time consuming because these venues will differ for different students and different projects. Specifically, the office hours and the SIG planning meetings will be different based on what SIG you're in. And so to resolve this issue, one thing that we have built into the orchestration engine is the ability to write situations around the venues that the community already has established. And it lets you do things, for example, such as prompt a student to plan for sending in progress work to your mentors during office hours so you could get feedback on it. And so here's what this looks like for both Agile Research Studio SIG on the right, or on the left, sorry, and the Networked Orchestration Technology SIG on the right. The reason both of these are shown is because the scripts are actually quite similar. And so in orange, what we see is that the situation in which the script should be enacted is actually identical across both of them. And so here, both these scripts will send a notification one day before the office hours for that SIG. And they'll send that notification to the Slack channel for that project. What's interesting, however, is by just changing the targets to which the script should apply to, so in the case on the left, it's to the students and the projects in the ARS SIG versus the students and projects in the not SIG on the right, at runtime, the triggers will behave differently. And so this allows mentors to actually compose these kind of situations that are actually identical semantically, but in runtime will execute differently based on who the scripts are targeting. And so here we're going to show a demo video of that. Okay, for this first demo, I'm going to show 2 scripts running that simulate what happens when you're able to script around different venues in the community. And so specifically, I'm going to run one for the office hours example for the ARS SIG and also for the Network Orchestration Technology SIG. And you'll see why in just a short moment. So for the ARS SIG, their office hours are on Monday every week, right? So what we'll see when I run this here is we see that the script is already stored in the system. So the same script that I showed a little bit earlier, right? When the script runs, it computes the next time that the office hours venue will be available. So it is available actually on Monday, but because the script has, you can't see it here, but because the script is set to ping you one day before, it computes it as one day before here. And this is in UTC, so -5 is why we get over here sending it at 3 p.m. on Sunday. And we also see that given the projects that this is supposed to be triggered for, it would send this to the skill growth and metacognitive reflection Slack channels. And so now, if I run the same thing, but for the Network Orchestration Technology SIG, what we'll see is that there should be a very similar structure here, but the time that the script will execute is very different because the Network Orchestration Technology SIG has their office hours on Tuesday. And so instead of getting a notification on Sunday, they get theirs sometime on Monday. And so we see that here at approximately 2 p.m. And we also see that their notification gets directed to Project OS, which is the Slack channel for orchestration scripting environments. All right, so for the second script, we'll take this idea of being able to script around these venues and extend it further to be able to script a process of working across multiple interactions in a venue. And so one thing that we try to do in DTR is really get students to work on deep prototyping slices where every single week they come in with a plan to test and build out a new set of arguments, create a testing plan, go and do testing on their prototype, discuss testing takeaways with their mentor, create revised arguments for the prototype, and then plan out the next slice that they'll do the week after. This is really, really important because by following this entire process, students are able to get a much deeper understanding on the research and the design space that their systems are trying to work in, rather than just building a bunch of stuff without actually testing and learning what does work and what doesn't work. This is really, really hard for students to do well, and one thing that often falls by the wayside is students will spend a lot of time designing and prototyping, but they won't actually do work to do the testing. So, for example, they might not create a testing plan, they might not reach out to users, and they might not actually schedule an actual test. And in the situations where they do those things, the other part that kind of falls by the wayside is that the actual analysis of the test results. It's just as important as doing the test itself to really understand what the results mean and how those results change the arguments that you already have. And so, like in the previous example, a mentor could reasonably write multiple Slack reminders for check-ins at each of these venues, and just to see how the student is doing. But we already saw how that's difficult potentially for just one check-in at one venue for multiple students. This would only make it even harder to do if you're trying to do it for many students. And this is for just prototyping. There could be others that you might want to do for example, writing a draft of a grant or writing a draft of a paper or study design. And so to resolve this challenge, what our system does is it takes the same idea of being able to encode around these venues and extends it to be able to have multiple triggers for different situations across a week for the same kind of script. So this script is really about helping students learn and practice the prototyping process by prompting them at different venues on what they should be thinking about at each point. So for example, early on it's mostly about planning the prototyping process as a whole, and then in studio midway through trying to check in to see whether they have a prototype, whether they have a study plan, what the plan might look like, any risks in that plan, and then later in the week trying to discuss the takeaways and trying to understand what those new findings mean for their study. At the same time, we can also encode separate check-ins for the mentor. So here what we see for the studio meeting is that the mentor will be prompted to just check in with their students on where things are. And this works really well here because the mentors and students are guaranteed to be together in the studio meeting. So it's a good opportunity for the mentors just to check in briefly with the student about what they were working on and where they're at. And so this example, here's the script that we just walked through for this example. So this part in red here shows how the script is executed when a sprint log of a project has a prototyping task in it. And then these three orange boxes show the different kinds of check-ins that would occur based on the venues that students are at, and each giving them a different reflection prompt. So as we talked about before, early in the week, with the first one being at SIG, it's mostly just to see like how their prototyping plan is and what they plan to do for the week. And then moving forward, it becomes more about trying to understand like their testing plan and what they have for a user test, and then later to actually do the takeaways. In orange, we also have the part about mentors being prompted. So here, they get prompted at a different time during studio versus the student being prompted well before studio and office hours to prepare for something. The mentor gets prompted during studio to go and check how their students are doing on the prototyping process. And so this is really useful, especially if they have multiple different students and multiple different projects at different stages, where if you had an ensemble of these scripts running, it would effectively give a mentor a list of things to check in with their students on, and just to see like where their students are at and what kinds of help they can give them during the MISO or peer research sessions. Okay, and here is a demo video. Okay, in this demo, I'm going to show the prototyping script that provides interactions at multiple venues throughout a week running in a simulation. And so the script is already preloaded into the system, and I'm just going to run a simulation here. And then what we'll see is that, so here is the original script, similar to what we saw earlier in the slides. And then here we see all the different feedback opportunities that have been computed for this script. So the first one here is for just checking in at SIG about what your prototyping plan is. The second one here becomes checking in during studio. And this is actually a couple hours before studio, so students can plan what to do at studio actually. This one here is, if you notice, the feedback outlet is for the mentor here. So this is for the mentor to go and check in actually during studio with the students. And this last one is a few hours before office hours for the students to think about what would be useful for them to talk about there. And so if we see it in simulation, Wednesday is when the student SIG is, so we see the SIG prompt go out. And then later on Friday, we see in the morning the prompt go out for students to think about what would be good to use Studio later today for. And then actually at Studio, we see the prompt being sent to the mentor about what are some things to check in, or it being a good time to check in with their students about how their prototyping is going. And then similar to the student one that we see here, we see the same thing for office hours here on Tuesday when their office hour session is. Okay, so the final demo, I'll be showing how scripts can be manually triggered as well. And so thus far, we really focused on scripts that are either automatically running all the time, like the very first script, or ones that have some sort of condition that is detected based on other tools or data in the community, like the second script that was detected using data from a sprint log. However, it's sometimes just too difficult to write a condition that would trigger a script, and sometimes a trigger might not be known a priori. So for these situations, it can be useful to enable a mentor to trigger a script manually, but still have the system track the actions that would happen throughout the week that could support the student in practicing a strategy that the mentor suggests. And so one example is having students use effective working structures for their deliverables, such as using a design argument template when working on a prospectus draft, or using a study design template when preparing a study for a paper. This example is largely the same as the prior example for the prototyping process that we just discussed, with the key difference being in the upper left corner where the mentor is actually the one triggering the scripts, like during, for example, a SIG meeting when they're talking about what working structures could be useful for their students. And so here's what an example of this script looks like. And this is probably the most different looking example that I've shown today because really only half of it's filled out. So the stuff in orange that you see here are the templated portions of the script. So being able to use appropriate representation is a pretty generic template that we can try to capture in the script. And for the sake of this script, like one of the things we'll want to do is make sure that the script runs right away and the template is provided to the student right away. And that's going to be shared across all instances of this version of the script. For simplicity, there aren't additional triggers here, but you could easily add more triggers to check in with the student during studio or during office hours, for example, just like we did with the prototyping script. Now, the big difference here is that the feedback that's provided and the actual target of the scripts are not encoded when the script is first built and templated out. Instead, these are injected when the mentor decides to trigger the script. And so in a moment, what we'll see is that we'll show an example of this script being triggered to help a graduate student who's working on their prospectus use a design argument templates to flesh out some of the argumentation behind each of the chapters in their dissertation. You could similarly use this kind of template to create a script to point a student to study design if they're working on a study for a paper for a first time. And here is a demo video for this. Okay, and for today's final demo, I'm going to show you a script being manually triggered. And so the way this works right now is I'm just using Postman to create an API request to a route that I have that will populate the template script and then start and save that into the database that we can then actually go and simulate. And if this were in deployment, it would actually be running normally, right? And so what I have here is this is just a script ID to the template script that's already stored. For students, we're going to add Leisha, who's a senior PhD student who just worked on her prospectus. And then the feedback message we have is to use the design argument learning module to get the design arguments for each section of the prospectus clear. And so when we run this, what we'll see is here is the actual script itself now fully filled out. So before, where we had nothing in the targets, we see students being populated with Leisha's name, but nothing for the projects because we didn't specify that here. And for this script, that's okay. We also see that the feedback message is now populated based on what we had written right here. So now if I go and simulate this exact script, we see that the script runs right away. And so it sends a message to Leisha over here about the same message that we had encoded earlier on. And like I said earlier, this could easily be extended to have multiple check-in points, just like we did for the prototyping script, where instead of being triggered on the data being changed in a sprint log, for example, a mentor could just manually trigger it, and then the system would then go and orchestrate different check-in prompts throughout the week.